So, welcome, Dr. Stephanie Grant, to the Sound Off. I'm so excited to have this time selfishly with you to just explore some really critically important work and to share you with our broader community.
It's good to be here.
Yay. So I did warn you, it's only fair that you know ahead of time to be prepared to think about what your super secret superpower might be. And it's always fun also to hear from folks like how they arrived at deciding on this. So tell us, what is something we would probably never guess about you, but that is just one of those things that helps you do what you do in the world.
Um, I would say that my superpower for that is I can put a positive spin on almost any child behavior. And so you've got, a kid who's finding their way out of every space you could put them in, and I think about their problem solving, or a kid who's taken Sharpie to something, and I can celebrate the fine motor, right? I think that that has definitely helped me personally. It's not something that I grew up doing. That was a very intentional, kind of development of seeing positive things, and then that certainly helps me in the work that I do.
That's so funny that you said that because 'cause I've literally seen you do that in some of the talks that you've
Mm.
given where you almost like it's like a physical thing happens in your body where you kind of like
Uh-huh.
take a deep breath in and then
Uh-huh.
you're like, I can like I almost see the reframing process
Yeah.
happening in your head and but so valuable. I've heard you give examples where, for example, this one I could relate to, so that's probably why it stuck with me. A child who just like bolts suddenly out of the learning area, or in your case, maybe the office or whatever, and you have a room full of people who you sort of have to like you have to somehow make this okay and make it okay for that student to come back in. And the example that you used was, I'm so glad you did that for your body. You needed that, and you just knew it, and you
Right.
took that, and as soon as you're ready, come back on in. We're ready for you. And
Mhm.
I'm like, yeah, I could
Yeah.
use that.
But I think that that's, also just a really good observation of that's not necessarily even my first instinct, right? And
Mhm.
so I always think of how we grew up has a lot to do with our initial instincts
Mhm.
and those cultural pieces and kind of just how we've been acculturated to do everything. And then it's our response that's much more cognitive that tells who we are right now. And for us as adults, when we think about maybe learning to work with student behaviors in a different way, that it's not a bad thing, it's not a shaming thing when our first, like, instinct is to be like, "Oh my gosh, that kid is making me miserable," or "Why can't they get control over that?" But for me, even after doing this for so many years, especially if it's my own kid, I still have to take that breath and do that reframe of like, "Nope, let's, come back from that." And kind of shift, brain gears and what part of the brain's leading that charge. But then, of course, I'm also going to remind you that we always have to do that with our kids too and understand that their first instinct is not an indication of who they are or necessarily what they feel or what they place value on, but it's very much an instinctual process. So we have
Yeah.
to pay attention to their second response and not their first reaction a lot of times.
That's gold right there. We joke about the, prefrontal cortex, and it's it's just not even really there yet for
Right.
most of our
Mhm.
little customers, our little clients. And yet, we most of us have been brought up with that sort of, "What's wrong with you?" What are you doing? What are you thinking? And they're not in that
Right.
moment, and
Mhm.
and so, like, their body, their instincts, some primitive, I don't know, God-given, design that, kind of puts them in that fight or flight or freeze or freak out or whatever it might be, and so just kind of going, "Yeah, no," I heard a teacher say once, like, "You are being such a child."
Uh,
And I was like, "Yeah,
mhm.
that
They are.
child."
Yep.
Stop being so childish.
Mhm.
So it's just such a powerful thing. Well, thank you for sharing that with us and modeling that in everything that you do in the work, and for we have to do it for ourselves, we have to do it for the grown-ups that we work with even, just a really helpful thing to do. So, I think we kind of already started moving in this direction, but I'd like to get to sort of the root of this as we talk about student behaviors and how we can support them, identify them, respond to them in more helpful ways and more guiding ways.
Mhm.
A lot of that really comes back to the cause of whatever that primitive reaction is. And you have spent a ton of your lifetime working on these issues. So let's kind of define them. What's at the root of a lot of these behaviors that we are so challenged by as parents, as educators in our schools and in our communities? What are we dealing with here?
So, I wanna use the word trauma, but I wanna kind of give it a little bit of a framework. And this probably is even a little bit of a different framework, Michelle, than what you've heard me speak about before. Trauma has become a really hot button word, right?
Yeah.
And everybody's talking about trauma-informed care and that sort of thing, and I love that, but the biggest push from that has, kind of paralleled along the ACE initiative with adverse childhood experiences.
Mhm.
And that has really helped us move forward in some fabulous ways. But I want to add that to a brain, trauma and stress really shouldn't be differentiated. And so, while we're going to use the word trauma as you and I kind of talk today, I don't want us kind of getting pigeonholed or listeners to get pigeonholed in that idea that we're looking for this like traumatized kid, when in reality, we're looking for a stressed out kid.
Mm.
And that the only difference really between whether we're talking about like traumatization or just like I'm stressed out right now is whether your brain just sort of visits that space of dysregulation and higher arousal, or whether it lives there, right? But
I know.
any one of our kids that we work with, any human that we're around, everybody can go to that place of increased arousal to the back part of our brain. We're driven more by reaction, by reflex with that. Not every kid lives there, right? But if you have a dysregulated kid in front of you because they stayed up too late or their blood sugar's low or something stressful is going on at home, you might see very different behaviors that are coming out of that stress response.
Mm.
But we consider those sort of weird or abnormal for that particular kid because we don't see them all the time. For some of our kids, life is just stressful. Their whole life has been stressful. It's been built around stress. And so they tend to live in those spaces. And those are the kids that, from a school safety perspective, we often think of more. Those are our high flyers, so to speak, where
Yeah.
they do create safety issues, either with aggression or with elopement, quite frequently.
Yeah, that's a really important differentiation for us, and I think it's also a bit more useful because, most of us don't have the background that you have, most of us that are interacting with kids, right? So, with trauma being such a buzzword, and I agree with you, it's good that we're becoming more trauma aware as a society. I don't have any diagnostic capabilities, and neither do most of the colleagues that I worked with in the school environment, so just being able to identify or just recognize stress, what's sort of a healthy stress response, I like how you kind of compared it to visiting that emotion. I remember actively with my own kids, just it's okay to be there for a little while. Like, you have every right to be so mad about this. It's not fair. But when you're done sitting with it for a little bit, let's get out of there together, right? Like, so those are sort of the healthy iterations or versions of that experience. And then there are the kiddos who you just don't seem to be able to help them kind of switch out of it. None of the tools in your tool belt or the typical person's tool belt are working for them. So
Right.
it's helpful.
Yeah. And the responses that we see with these kids, there aren't bad responsives. They're just adaptive. Um, and they're just not super adaptive for a school environment. Um, and there are lots of reasons why our kids right now are coming in with higher levels of stress, higher levels of trauma, that their brain has sort of developed in these different ways. Parenting strategies, certainly the drug epidemic. But, one of the things that I think is really important to consider is we're asking our students to learn in different ways than they've ever learned before. We're
Mm.
asking them to do things like critically think. We're asking them to do things about reasoning and problem solving and knowing how to like get to the solution, which are fabulous things, but they require more of our brain than
Oh, yeah.
just like rote memorization, right? And so there are lots of students who might have been able to handle a classroom setting where all they had to do was sit there and memorize or give you an answer. But that's not what we're asking our kids to do. And what we're asking our students to do in our schools quite frequently is just going to require more of them and requires their brain to be in a better space. And so I think one of the reasons our schools do see, in some ways, more stress related behaviors is because we're requiring kids to be in a more regulated space. And so they can't like fly under the radar, so to speak, with so many of those pieces.
Wow, that's such a good point. I think about, my education, it was very rote, here are the answers. Memorize them for the test. It will be on Friday.
Right.
And just thank God I had that kind of brain that could do that, but wasn't a whole lot of critical problem solving or, critical thinking expected. And then when I became a teacher, that was, like, the dominant, thread, the movement of and I thought it was the greatest thing ever because they could have the freedom to be creative and, we could explore together and it would be more adventurous, but it is actually more stressful. 100%. Yeah,
Right.
100%.
Because we think of the brain as a thinking organ and it's not. So out of all of the parts to your brain, and there are a ton of them, there's only two parts that think. And the more stressed out you get, the less you can access those. And so there used to be a lot of things in a school environment that kids could do successfully and still be totally stressed out and not really thinking. So we didn't see behavior issues. But
Right.
now for kids that we're requiring them to do critical thinking and problem solving, like we're requiring them to be at this very front parts of their brain. And so they can't be stressed out and be there. And so they're not successful. And we're seeing again kind of just that duality of requirements and their brain isn't sure which direction to go.
Wow. Okay, so when we think about the child brain, like, can you give us, like, just a little bit of a one-on-one of, like, what it is and what it's not? Because I think I still see, adults approaching that child brain of all the different ages and stages that we, that we host in our school communities in some very adult ways, with some
Right.
very
Mhm.
adult expectations. So let's talk about the unique animal that is the child.
A human child. Um, So our brains develop back to fronts, okay? And the more survival pieces are going to be put in first, and then we kind of move to those higher order pieces. The brain starts to develop very shortly after conception with the development of the neural tube. But the human brain does not stop developing until adulthood, on average about 22. There is an average gender difference with females reaching full neurologic maturity about 17 or 18, males not until 27, 28. So that's like a 10-year gap,
That's a big gap.
huge gap. And we also now have newer research that shows us that any kind of neurodivergence slows down brain development and when we finally mature. So, a lot of our neurodivergent kiddos, whether that's ADHD, autism, certainly a traumatized brain falls in there, their brain development isn't often getting fully done until their 30s. And when we think of, the brain, certainly you're like, it might help to think of it as having like the back space is reflex, the middle area is more reaction, and then the front area is more intention. So I think for especially in school spaces, that can be helpful terminology. But the more stressed out we get, the more we go from intention to reaction and then all the way back to reflex. And for our kids, a lot of what's getting developed is not that intentional space way up in the front. What's getting developed is that reflex space in more in the diencephalon area, or really a lot in the limbic system. And that limbic system has several parts of the brain kind of clustered together, but they all either do like negative affect, like fear and anger, or stress responsivity. And there's a very big difference between how fast these parts of the brain are. So if I told a kid to sit still, but I said it maybe like in an adult voice where I raise my eyebrows and deepen my voice, snap my fingers as I was like, sit still, right? That could send them into a stress response because their limbic system detected potential threat.
Yeah.
And if your limbic system's scanning for threats, doing that multiple times a second, I think it's important to realize the threat doesn't have to be real. It just has to be like possible, maybe threat to activate a stress response, and start to finish, like detection of possible threat in that limbic system to my body has now run out of a classroom or knocked over a desk or thrown something or said something nasty. That only takes 50 milliseconds start to finish. And that's not even enough time for like those front parts of your brain to understand the words that the teacher said, like sit down or be still or whatever else. And so the student is not making a good choice or bad choice, right? They are reacting, and they're reacting to the sensory input. They are not reacting even to the request.
So I love what you just said about the good choice, bad choice piece. If I could go back in my teaching career and erase that whole narrative, there was a whole period of
Yeah.
time where, we talked about good choices and poor choices,
Mhm.
that's a poor
Which,
choice,
by the
and
way, is better than like good kid and bad kid, which
for
was what
sure,
that was in response to. So,
we were
like, we're moving.
evolving. Yeah, we were evolving, but I just think about, some of that language and how inaccessible that that would have been to a child who that part of their brain, it wasn't even a choice. "What are you talking about? I have no idea what just happened to me, and you're judging my actions based on, whether I had the power or I chose wrong somehow."
Right,
And then you're making me go cool out over here and stop and think. We literally had, this lovely little stop, think, and decide corner, you know? Again, critical thinking. We're asking you to problem solve,
right.
this awful thing just happened. You exploded all over the place, and now you got you've gotta go be trapped with yourself and stop and think and problem solve and come to me with a better solution, a better choice. I'm like, "Oh, I'm with you." It's a little
Yeah,
bit better than what I had, when I
right,
was a kiddo, but at the same time, it's just not very aware of the actual physiology of,
right.
of what's going on in front of us.
Well, and I don't know about you, but if I were having big feelings and stressed out and my husband, like, came to me and he's like, "Stephanie, I need you to make a good choice here and, like, go over here and stop and think." Like, I'd get ticked off. I would feel
Right.
totally misunderstood, right?
Mhm.
Like, so it's always interesting that we give the adults in our world so much more grace for their behavior and their feelings than we give to our kids who have very undeveloped brains.
100%. No, I think that's a really helpful way sometimes to think about would I do this to any other human? Would I speak to any other human in this way? Would I have this expectation of them? And then on top of it, is it appropriate to expect this little developing brain to be able to function in this way? So
Right,
so many things we're learning, and being taught, by our kiddos. I know for my part that most of the learning I have done, to be a better educator, a better mom, it's been from my little charges. They've been my best teachers, and
absolutely.
I
Mhm.
I I believe that to be the case with you.
Yes.
And so I'd love for you to share with us, a couple little nuggets that you've
Oh,
learned along the way. It could be from your own kiddos. It could
oh,
be from,
sure.
some of the kiddos that you've worked with.
So I'm, foster and adoptive parent too. We have 5 kiddos, a couple biological, 3 that we adopted out of foster care. Right now, they're 15 down to 5.
Wo
Um, and we did foster care for about 10 years. So, I mean, when I parented my firstborn, right, I parented based off of because I had the degrees already. I parented based off of the research we had then, right? And so it was very behavioral, it was very reinforcement driven,
Yes.
um, pushing into cry it out, like all of those things, right? And fortunately, unfortunately, I don't know. Fortunately, it like the newer research started coming out very early in my parenting journey, but I still don't know that I would have paid attention to it as much if we hadn't have started fostering about that same time.
You gotta learn
Um,
fast.
I
Yeah,
gotta
you gotta
learn really fast, and I had to shift gears, and I was given permission to shift gears because while I think this is just great work for humans, right? I was given permission to sort of let the old stuff go out of the excuse of, "Well, these kids are different, right?
yeah.
These are foster kids," right? So I probably got there faster than I otherwise would have, because that stuff might have worked fine for just my bio kids, but so I've had lots of learning experiences over the years. Like, I remember I I've been the parent that has been on the receiving end of those phone calls of student elopement or, or of kids getting aggressive and them having to do room clears. Like, I've been the parent where and it's always harder as the professional, right?
Yeah.
Because I want to go in and be mom, and I feel like I still have to kind of wear that professional hat, and I want to just cry and go, "I don't know what to do either,"
No, with you.
right,
I'm
in
so
those
with
moments.
you. Yeah.
But, like, I remember we had this sweet little honey who was a runner, and, like, his teacher and I very quickly learned we had to do a hand-to-hand trade-off, right, because he would run everywhere. And I, was getting him prepared for a zoo field trip, which was always funny because this cute little teacher walked out and she's like, "So we're getting ready for a class field trip to the zoo." And you could just see her anxiety all over her body of like, "I can't keep this kid in a classroom. What am I gonna do at the zoo?" So we came up with a plan, but I was doing my job of helping him get prepared for a zoo field trip. We were doing social stories. We were talking like about pictures, and his anxiety got higher and higher until he finally showed me that he had no context for a zoo. And so what I had been telling him is that I was going to take him and these other kids and send them to a place where wild animals existed and that I expected him to have fun. And he had no idea that there were like enclosures, right? That these wild animals couldn't get to him. And this kid hadn't been like very safe a day in his life yet. And so, like, of course, he was getting more agitated. So that was this lovely experience for me of remembering that if I haven't taught it, I can't assume that a kid knows it,
No.
right?
Yeah. Yeah, what are exactly, so different. What are your
Yeah,
and I think for educators, it's kind of a similar it's kind of and school counselors, all of us are, we're receiving the students, but they're not all coming to us with the same experiences or
right.
prior knowledge or any of that. So it's just a matter of getting to the bottom of that, like, what's happening?
Yeah.
What's happening in your head? Where is this coming from? And then
And
it's like,
that
"Oh,
behavior always tells a story.
it
Um,
does."
I had another kid that came into my house and she wasn't a runner, but she would shut down and freeze, and if anything, she hid. But we were walking up the stairs once, and I remember this, I was behind her, fortunately, and she got stressed out by a noise and immediately curled into a ball like a little possum, but because we were on the stairs, she started rolling backwards.
Oh, boy.
And I was because I was behind her, able to scoop her up. But it was such a beautiful example of how unintentional and fast that behavior occurs. Like, she didn't stop and think, "Hey, this is a
We're
great strategy," or "This is a great coping skill," right? She
right.
just immediately reacted to it. Because when we see it in a situation like that, it's so clear she had no intention to it. But when we see kids throwing stuff or running or spewing verbal vomit, it's so much more of like this internal gymnastics we're having to do to understand that there's often so much less intention still there, or that kids aren't meaning what they say, or that they're still stressed out when they're causing chaos and hurting everybody. But it's helpful for me to just even go back to that mental image because I just remember how fast that was and how quickly I had to react in order to just catch her. So, yeah.
Wow, they are just the best teachers. It's amazing, and I'm in awe of the experiences that you share and the honesty that you bring to these conversations. I think too often, with our kiddos in our schools and communities, we wanna have all the answers, I would have parents coming to me saying, "Well, this is happening. What's the answer?" I can't get this to work. He won't do this. He won't do that. Like, fix him. What is
Right.
the answer here? What is that? And actually, I think what I hear from you almost every time you share one of these kind of like life lessons from a child, it's, well, we kind of got to go back to the child, and kind of have to understand the context and the experiences, and then all of a sudden it starts to make sense, and then we can kind of figure out how we're going to work our way out of it.
Yeah,
It's pretty
absolutely.
pretty complicated stuff.
Mhm.
So let's talk about how this work, so much of this work of supporting kiddos is about better preparing us grown-ups for what they're going through, what their needs might be, how we can better communicate with them. Many of the kiddos that are in our schools and communities are like my Josephine, they're nonverbal,
Mhm.
so how do we even, begin to do that? So I think I'd be interested to hear about how you approach this with the grown-ups and all of our prior experiences as students and what we learned or maybe mislearned in school, in preparation for our roles as SROs or school counselors or school leaders or whatever that might be. How do we better help adults, wrap their heads around the realities of helping and supporting our students in this world?
So I think one of the first things to just kind of center ourselves in is that what we know isn't wrong. It's just not true for everybody, right? So all of this stuff that incredible teachers and counselors, school staff have been doing for years is absolutely great for brains who can think. And the research supports it. We just like Head Start was one of the ones that really helped shift that conversation because Head Start was the first entity to question whether or not we were including all the students we need to include in the research, right? And
Yep.
so we have tons of research and of decades of research. What works when kids can think, when they can go to those front parts of their brain, because those are the kids that parents bring to research studies, right? Like if you're trying to get your kid to a school, if you're trying to get them to not punch people, you don't sign them up for a research study due to a $10 Amazon gift card, right? Like it's not on your radar. So
No way.
for
Even $100 is
oh,
not gonna make it.
absolutely, right? So for the longest time, we just missed this population. And so all these professionals would say, no, seriously, as long as you're consistent, as long as you find the right reinforcer, right? Like this stuff works. And Head Start really was the first group to say, I think we're missing something. And fortunately, we were getting the neuroscience to really help us understand that. So I want people to really know that other stuff isn't bad. We're not throwing it out. We just need to add tools to our toolkit to understand that when brains are in a different level of arousal, we need different things to be successful. And I think that's an easier shift for most adults, that it's not that that stuff was bad and you've been doing it wrong, but we want to support you in like being just as successful as you know you can be with this other group of kids that are also struggling. And that group of kids is occurring at a higher proportion than it used to too, and they're harder to ignore. So that I think that would be my first kind of shift for that.
Mhm. That's fantastic. as I think about that sort of toolkit, what are a few of those things? Just I know, you do full day trainings. I mean, we could list hundreds of things that you would like us all to know, to have, but maybe just a few of your top choices, tools in the toolbox that you would love to see our educators, our school counselors, our SROs, our bus drivers, all of us, and parents, all of us that are involved in the growing of young minds and young children.
Absolutely. And I think we should, pause and also note we've been using the word kiddo a lot, which kind of has an early childhood connotation.
Right, yeah.
Um, I call teenagers that probably, just not to their face, but,
It
we
doesn't
need
work.
to remember no, that any brain that gets stressed out is at the same developmental level, okay? So when we're gonna start talking strategies and thinking about that, it does not matter how old you are, if you're 3, 13, 33. um, the more stressed out you get, the younger you get neurologically. And so
Mhm.
you use the strategies differently. You don't use the word kiddo, right? But the strategy is the same for the kindergartners as the seniors in high school if we are working with that high stress brain. So that's an
Ye
important piece to
That's
remember.
like a revelation, I would say, to a lot of people. I think just realizing, yeah, I mean, you see that in adult. I think
Oh,
I'm probably
absolutely.
right? Like, if I'm in that moment of high stress, I can literally point to, I'm reduced to tears. I'm a kindergartner all of a sudden. Things are not working like a 50-something-year-old lady, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's just not working. So that's really helpful. But you're absolutely right. I think, we do. My background is early ed and elementary ed. So I'm definitely leaning more toward the honeys and the kiddos and
Right.
Cs and all of that. And they all are. Um, and you're right. We certainly wouldn't want to call any of our older students kiddos, and children doesn't go so well.
No.
But that's a really interesting point about the brain, and it kind of goes back in time almost.
Right, and sometimes all the way down to infancy. So we
Oh, wow.
can, share with your listeners too. I like to use Bruce Perry's arousal level continuum graphic. And so that can actually chart it out where you can see, oh, okay, this is how stressed out somebody is. This is the part of their brain they're working at. This is what might work. This is how old they are developmentally. So we can definitely share that with listeners too. Um, but a couple strategies. The first one that I would say actually borrows from Heather Forbes' language, and she has a great book for educators called Help for Billy, which is a good resource. One of my like go-to trauma books for schools. But she talks about how you always have to bring together this duality as an adult of Mr. Rogers coupled with an army general, because sometimes we get into trauma work and we start talking about stories, kids have gone through, and the instinct people have is to feel like then they can't put in boundaries. And that is 100% not the case. Like, it does not matter what a kid has gone through or how much empathy I have for them. They are not allowed to just destroy a classroom or hit people or, get unsafe. And in fact, a lot of those kids need tighter boundaries than other students. And so that would be one thing I would say, is that if it's not a safety issue, we are like Mr. Rogers, happy to see you, neighbor. But if there are safety issues there, then they're just lines that we don't let kids
Yeah.
cross, and that we have plans for what to do once students get unsafe. And those plans are really important, not just for that student that's causing the safety issue, but those plans, and think of it like a fire drill, right? That we would use in case of a fire, that we have a safety plan that we've posted and taught and rehearsed for when students get unsafe with behavioral issues. That plan is one of the best ways to prevent secondary trauma in both the adults in that room as well as the other students. So that would be one of my like biggest strategies to pass on.
I love that. I wish I would have had that. In many cases, just had to kind of make it up on the fly and then, develop those tools over time. But I think just like any other crisis we have to manage, and we manage a lot of them in schools, that thinking ahead what's that, designated safe area for that student in the classroom? How will we then communicate if we need support from another staff member? What's the process for that or the mechanism? I remember trying to figure out, I'm in my classroom all by myself. I have no communication except to scream and shout down the hall. Like, we need a better plan,
Right.
I'm gonna need something else for this kiddo. So planning ahead, and I think too, I would add maybe, um, you know, when there's a "I don't know" kind of a response, I think a lot of times staff members are like, I'm happy for little Donnie to be in my classroom. I adore him and I wanna support him." Periodically, he will throw desks and chairs, and I need a plan for that. I need to know, what we're gonna do, and the answer will, kind of often be like, "I don't know. I don't have an answer for you," or, "We just don't have anything in place for that, you'll just have to figure it out." And that's just not okay.
Right.
It's not fair to that child, and we as the adult are the advocate for that child. It's not fair to all the other little children who will or big children who will have to witness this, violent episode in the classroom. It's not fair to the educator either. So, and really not accepting that,
Right.
really pushing back and
Yes.
saying, "No, I know that that's not okay," and finding your teammates in the building, who will push for those actions and those plans and solutions together.
Right. And to know that, we lose our ability to critically think, when we get more stressed out too, and so that plan helps prevent a whole lot of safety issues. It helps prevent us from continuing to escalate things. So they're really protective even for, like, at the district level, if we start thinking about legal pieces and, lawsuits and things like that. So I'm very, very much a big advocate that we need student behavior safety plans to be in place just like we would have a tornado plan or a fire drill or, whatever.
Oh, that is fantastic and so helpful. We have, I think a program called Especially Safe
Yes.
that, has built individual safety plans, for students of a variety of different, challenges and needs, and I would squarely put this there, if there's a child who has trauma experiences, that's someone who's going to need a plan to support them, and maybe they don't have violent outbursts, but, maybe they will unexpectedly in the middle of, the classroom curl up into a possum ball,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
I need a plan, because if I need to move them while we are, evacuating the building, I'm gonna need a plan,
Mhm. Right.
I might not be able to physically carry that person out
And
safely.
and that's a great example because I had to do this with a school just recently because this student dissociates so hardcore they can't wake him up because of stress.
Yeah,
And he's older, right? So they can't carry him out. And so we had to think through, okay, in the case of a fire or, whatever else, what is your plan to get this kid out of a building, right? Because nobody had stopped to think about, okay, this kid is just dissociating. I can't just wake him up so
mhm,
that he can walk out on his own. So we did
right.
have to put one of those plans in.
I know, and it's like, we can work the problem, we
Mhm.
really can, but, for whatever reason, I guess I see all too often in our school communities that it's like, I don't have an answer for that, and thank God we live in a safe community, or we really none of these fire drills are actually they're just drills, it's
Mhm.
okay, we don't have
Right.
to worry about that, and that is not good enough.
No, not at all.
Your point about, kind of the reminder about liability,
Mhm.
and, it's a good one because for better or worse, we're living in a very litigious time, and sometimes that is the way to get our school leaders' attention, sometimes that's a way to get support from the board for designated time to be intentional about these planning activities and, finding solutions and sourcing a wheelchair that we will use to help, get that child out to safety if they are dissociated, if they are frozen. So, we can solve those problems, but
We can.
we won't, just like you mentioned for our kiddos, we won't have that fully thinking brain in the middle
No.
of crisis
Mm-mm.
either. So this idea that people are gonna somehow MacGyver their way out of And I'm aging myself, but at least you know what I'm talking about.
I
MacGyver
know.
was a great show, young people.
Yes.
It was a great show, and he would
Oh, there's
solve.
a new one. Did you know that?
Is there? Oh,
Yes.
we're in, like, the remake world. I
Mhm.
love it,
Yeah.
I love it. But yeah, like, that you would somehow be able to just, like, I don't know, take a Crayola marker and, you know, jigger the lock and, that's not us. We're
No.
not, and even MacGyver. So lots and lots to think about here. So, those are really important tools. I think the planning piece, reminding people to work together in an organized way. It tends to be that the solutions are pretty simple ones, but you're not going to get to that, in
Mhm.
a moment of crisis. So, any other tools that you would love our folks to have in that tool
Um,
belt?
we kind of hit on it a little bit, but just like the power of the pause, that if it is not a safety issue and you have a student who acts annoying, disrespectful, does something that's like super mildly unsafe, like we're talking throwing something at a wall, not a stapler at somebody's head, that sometimes the only strategy you need is just to sort of pause and not react yourself to that situation because there are a big chunk of students that as long as you don't react and you hold space or maybe just prompt with a slight like try that again, whatever that might be, then that's all they need to flip to that cortical area, think, come up with the choice that you want them to have, and then they act it out, right? So, a lot of times we jump so fast on the unintentional reaction that we end up reinforcing that stress response and not even giving time for that intentional behavior to show up. So, that would be one. In terms of safety issues, I also think that I would just always include the golden rule that if you cannot make it better, please don't make it worse. And typically that means you need to stop talking. Just a reminder that as people get, more stressed out, your language center shut down. And so you can't logic with the limbic system anyway, but, just stop trying to reason with these kids. Stop trying to reinforce or give consequences, like threaten things, that brain is not gonna do it, and any kind of words a lot of times with stressed out kids will continue to escalate things, so if you don't know how to make it better, just shut your mouth so we don't
Yeah.
make it worse.
I know, and I think that that's a golden rule for everybody in
Uh-huh.
all areas of life, I would say. I think, I think of, sort of like post tragedy for us, a lot of people were, "Oh, I don't know what to say," and I'm like, "I got news for you, I don't remember anything you said.
Yeah,
I remember you physically being present, and that was meaningful to me." And so, for anybody who's listening and worries about the right words, oftentimes in that moment where your world is kind of spiraling out of control, the words are not helpful. They're not even kind of permeating the
no.
membrane.
Mm-mm.
So it's like, just turn it off.
Yep,
Turn it off. The words are for you. That's not really helping the person.
absolutely. Yeah.
So I want to shift the conversation to another topic that I think relates to trauma, and we've never talked about this before. So I'm interested to hear what you would say. But a lot of the work we do, sort of more broadly in school safety, is around the planning and preparation, and like you said, with drills, like um, talking about it. We advocate, preparing and a little exploration time and some games and a lot of rehearsal and all of this in a zero stress, no stimuli, no simulation of anything ever, kind of an environment, just to get comfortable with, you know what, if I had to get out of here, I know all the ways I can get out of here. If I needed to be out of sight for any reason, I have pre-planned a lot of really good spots for myself, and how empowering I believe that is. I know that that was empowering for my 2 daughters, who survived, after the tragedy, to be able to go back to school, but needed to know, like, how do I get out if I have to?
Right.
Where do I go? How could I, if I needed to, keep a danger out, an unsafe person out, or where could I hide out if I had to until help arrived. So some of those super, super basics are things that we talk a lot about in addition to those regular procedures and protocols like fire drills and,
Mhm.
locking the classroom down, or any number of things that our schools are engaged in just so there's that kind of muscle memory for a moment of crisis, so nobody has to think. But I think there are conversations around is it okay to talk to kids about this stuff? Is it okay to have these drills? Is it okay to point out that you as a human being have rights to if it's not safe here, you can go. How do you how do you how do you look at those issues in terms of keeping our kids not just physically safe, but psychologically safe?
That's a great question, and it even came up, um, like, when we had COVID, because I work with trauma and kids in schools, I was doing lots of COVID stuff too. So, the one thing that I would say is that for kids, the biggest predictor of whether something's hard or whether or not something's, like, actually really stressful is the adult's response to it.
Oh, yeah.
So, when we go through teaching kids any kind of drill, I don't think we probably do enough work around coaching the adults that are gonna be doing that drill on what their body should be doing and what their tone of voice should be like and what their facial expressions should be like. Because the biggest message we want to give is like, dude, in a crisis, I've got this, right? Here's the plan. We're going to follow the plan. Let's practice the plan. But I would extend that to say that, especially when we're talking about like school shootings and things like that, the parents also need to be informed and taught how to
Oh, yeah.
have these conversations. So, this has been certainly in my community lately. There's been a lot of like TikTok things and then call ins, right? And then the parents are getting that news and the parents are having conversations that the kids are either overhearing or directly having conversations about. And the parents need coached too
Okay.
about how to have those conversations and what your body should do and your facial expressions and your tone of voice, because that's one of the best ways to protect our kids. I mean, in my generation, I was like overly prepared for fires. Like the number of
It
times
was
we
a big
did, right? Stop, drop, and roll, right? Um,
it was a big deal.
but I also don't remember being like afraid of fires. I think the adults
Ye
did a really good job of that. Now we have adults that are stressed out and scared.
Yeah,
And that's a really hard thing to navigate,
yeah,
not just for our staff, but for our parents of, I want to tell you you're safe at school, but are you safe at school? Like that's a whole like situation in and of itself.
right.
But I think the message we need to really just kind of focus on with our kids is it is my first job to keep you safe. And if this is not safe, here's what I'm going to do, right? Here is our plan. I know some schools will do really intense simulations, okay? Because and the argument I've heard for that is we need these brains or these bodies to be able to do it under high levels of stress. One, I am not an advocate for that, but
Me neither.
two, I would always just remind people that the brain doesn't make a differentiation between positive net stress and negative stress, okay?
Love
So
that.
stress is stress to the brain. If you think that you need your kids to be able to do something under high stress, you need to both practice it when they're calm, and if you really want them to be able to do it under stress and practice, just get them silly and hyper and it will do the same thing. Okay? So if you feel like you need a kid to practice something even when they're dysregulated and a little too aroused, go through the drill extra silly and extra fast and extra hyper, and the brain will still practice doing it when they're aroused. We do not want to stress out kids. I am treating way too many kids with school avoidance
Yes.
and anxiety disorders and all sorts of things, and working with parents who don't feel confident in saying, it's okay, you're going to go to school, you're safe there,
Yep.
because of how we're sort of navigating a lot of these pieces.
So that's really interesting. So our position,
Mhm,
so everybody and everyone who's listening, I'm sure knows, our position is the same. I don't firmly don't believe that it's necessary to inject that kind of stress to teach the movements and the that kind of muscle memory. I do think that kids need to walk through those
mhm,
steps, be
100%.
comfortable.
Mhm,
I love well, of course, I'm a teacher, so I'm biased, but I like the opportunity for them to explore and, sort of tabletop and do social stories, and ends up being a very productive time because we're also getting some social emotional stuff in there
yeah,
and some reading and all of that stuff. So it's very exciting to me to see more teaching before training. That's
yes,
what we
yes,
advocate.
yes.
But this idea of training students with this sort of high simulation, it comes from a good place. It comes from the adult public safety folks who
Mhm,
train that way
right.
and need to train that way and signed up to train that way and have been doing it over a period of time. And again, they're adults, and that brain is finished. They have all those parts of the brain have been built out that you described, and that is not the case with our students, even our high school students who you think look like adults and in some ways act like adults, and can be a little bit smarter sometimes than the adults, but they're still not finished, and so this idea that that is necessary is, I believe, just inherently untrue, but also, could be so very damaging to that developing brain. So, the I think, the point that you bring up about how we train our adult staff members to have these conversations with students and how we train our parents is critically important. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you say they're not comfortable. And when they're not comfortable, it shows. And that says to kids, oh, there's not really a plan.
Right.
Or, oh, they're just saying this. This isn't true. And now my trust in this person is beginning to erode. So I really think that's another area where we need to do better, where we need to spend significant time with adults, with parents, with educators, whoever is delivering this instruction or practicing these drills with our kiddos. They need to be confident. And I think the more time we spend with staff around the country doing professional development around these topics, that's a foundational piece that we have got to back the bus up and get everybody comfortable with their plans, their bodies, the reality of how their body may or may not react in a crisis, and getting them comfortable with the plans that we have before we really, go there with our students.
Yeah.
It's
And
a
by
lot.
the way, those first responders and everything that, like, regularly do have to do that high intense work, still neurologically different, right? Like, their
No.
brain did change or already came in kind of that
Yeah.
way. So it's not that they are going through that repetitively and not having an impact either.
No, I know, and, that's a really good point. Many of them have to do other things, healthy things, supportive things, therapy,
Right.
counseling, those types of things to be able to bear that burden on our brains. So, yeah,
Mhm.
not the same, not the
No.
same. Well, thank you for weighing in on that, because I think that will continue to be a conversation that we push nationally. We have some new resources coming out that I'm really excited about that help and support that. So maybe we'll suck you into that, Dr. Grant, a little
Yeah.
bit. Love to have your eyes on that. So many valuable things today. So I want to give you a chance to leave our listeners with I know I think I have like 10 plus takeaways from today, but at least just one thing that's actionable, that we can go back to our communities with, that we can go back to our role, whatever that may be in the school community, and maybe do this a little differently, do this a little bit better. It's your chance to sound off.
Hmm. Well, it's something that we didn't, like, push into a lot, But you sort of, opened the door when you were talking about how after the tragedy your family experienced, people just showing up and doing relationship work actually made the biggest difference.
Yeah.
And I know I do mental health right, but I'm not talking like this sugar sweet, like, gushy sort of thing. Neurologically, physiologically, having other people that show up and do relationship work with us that can get us being silly or can laugh with us, or with our boys that might do small levels of competition, or with our girls that might do like shared disclosure, or, like we sing together, do rhythmical things, class callbacks. Doing those sorts of relational based interactions releases oxytocin in our brain, which downregulates cortisol, which, I mean, long story short, relationships decrease stress. And so the most powerful tool I could ever give somebody in working with kids is their own relationship with that child. Like, I could give you tons of different strategies, but the biggest thing is you. Like, you are the biggest strategy. And that has such big implications for not just in the moment, but long term and generational stuff that's super cool to talk about. So don't ever underestimate the power of the relational work that you do with these kids. And obviously, we've heard the adage that like the kids who need it most, or the kids who often push against it the most, are hardest to work with. But it's going to be your interactions and relationships with kids, especially when they're not stressed, that is going to make the biggest impact on decreasing those stress issues and decreasing the safety issues when they are stressed. And so just try to push into that, try to invest in those relationships. And if you don't feel it coming natural, like YouTube videos, right, that you can both laugh at, are just an easy way to kind of start that conversation.
Wow. Drop the mic. That's amazing. So, this has been an incredible conversation with Dr. Stephanie Grant on the Sound Off. Thank you so much for joining us. You must come back and talk to us more. There's just so much to explore, so much to learn from you. I want to thank you for the work that you're doing to keep our kiddos, our communities, our schools safe and sound.
Thanks so much.